Today I'd like to continue our discussion that we started about Olam Haba, the world to come. What is it? What does it look like? What are we waiting for? We've been following the reading of the Rambam's introduction to the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin. It's called Perek Chelek. And this essay, this mini essay, the Rambam Maimonides gives a lengthy introduction to what exactly the reward coming to us in the future world will be, and of course what the punishment will be if we don't merit to it. After all the introductions which we've had about why to do mitzvot for its own sake, not in order to get the reward or to avoid the punishment, we finally can reach today the discussion of what is Olam Haba. And the Rambam describes something which is very hard to describe. He says, if you take somebody who's colorblind and you try to explain to him what is the color yellow, he can't see it. What is green? What is red? Can you really describe that in words? Or if you have somebody who's lo aleinu deaf, he can't hear anything. You try to describe to them what the world of sound is like. It's almost impossible. When we talk about different types of pleasures that a person can have, we speak about the five senses: taste, smell, touch, sight. But the world to come, Olam Haba, is a spiritual pleasure. It's something which is very hard for us to describe without having any of the senses to guide us. Maimonides wants to make very sure that you realize that this is not a cop-out. Take a king who grew up as a young boy. He loved to play soccer. He loved to follow sports. He loved to play sports. And as he's being groomed to be the king, he gets older and older, and slowly he starts to be interested in other things, perhaps other people, other areas of life. He's interested in, starts realizing that he's going to be the king of a kingdom. He's going to be running a country. So he learns about politics. He learns about who's greater than who. And power ultimately can be exerted on the soccer pitch, if you will, on the soccer field, but ultimately can also be wielded much stronger on the throne of his kingdom. And so he starts to get interested and involved in political machinations. Here we have, in the democratic countries, of course, we have elections. And who's going to be in this party, and who's going to be in that party, who's going to vote for me, and how do I curry favor, and how do I find favor with the electorate? All sorts of calculations and considerations. And this world starts to envelop him and to interest him. How can I garner support? How can I make a pact, a treaty of political support in this issue, and then I'll get political support in the other issue? And this world becomes so exciting to him, and he realizes that he can have success through this whole other avenue of life, that soccer gets really pushed down to the side. If you ask him, what would you rather do? Have your meetings with the heads of state in order to make the changes that you wanted to make in your country, or to have a soccer game? He would say, perhaps it's a little bit exciting to me to play soccer, and that's fun, but ultimately the developed person gains a lot more enjoyment and satisfaction from accomplishing things on the level which he's reached. And so too, the Rambam says with Olam Haba. Perhaps food and drink and all these physical pleasures that you can imagine, they're attractive to us, perhaps now, or as you grow up. We remain physical creatures. We always need our food and drink, and we enjoy the senses. We enjoy things of this world. But ultimately, the greater pleasure is when we get greater and we develop more, and we become spiritual beings, and the ultimate, highest level of pleasure that a person can reach is what the Rambam calls spiritual pleasure. And that's the spiritual pleasure that spiritual beings have. And what's unique about this pleasure, as opposed to all the pleasures that we've been mentioning, that we know and we recognize from this world, is that just like the things of this world, they have a beginning, but they also have an end. They may be sweet, they may be tasty, it may be enjoyable for now. But just like the physical world, where they exist, they are finite, and they have an end. Whereas when you talk about spiritual pleasures, enjoying something which is ephemeral, something which is not of this world, it is of a kind of the spiritual world, which is ultimately infinite. It's like that king that doesn't care anymore, or doesn't need anymore to play soccer, but he finds his pleasure in greater things in spirituality. So ultimately, Olam Haba, the Rambam says, you should know, is definitely not 70 virgins. It's definitely not enjoying kicking back on that beachfront with your pina colada in your hands. But it's something which is more real, something which is more pleasurable, something which is eternally pleasurable. And then the Rambam says, I have a little bit of a proof for you, that perhaps we can recognize that even in this world, those things that are not tangible are even more pleasurable than the physical enjoyments which we can have. For example, have you ever seen anybody that is willing to forego a physical pleasure for a spiritual one? It happens to us all the time. Many things that we'd like to taste, we don't taste because what would people say? What are we going to look like? We refrain from physical pleasure because maybe I'll be embarrassed to be in public, to publicly be seen like that. Embarrassment is a little bit more spiritual than the physical world of enjoying taste and smell. And so Maimonides claims and says, we see that if you're willing to not bite into that juicy piece of steak, or you're not going to gobble down that spaghetti and meatballs when you're on a date because you're afraid that you're going to get all dirty and you'll be embarrassed, what are you doing? You're forgoing the physical pleasure because you realize that embarrassment is greater and worth more to you than enjoying that physical pleasure. So ultimately, Olam Haba is something which is not of this world. And the description used by the sages, that in the world to come, tzadikim yoshvim ve'atrotehem beroshehem ve'ne'enim biziv hashchina. The tzadikim, the righteous ones, they're sitting at a table, and they have their crowns on their heads, and they're enjoying the light of the divine presence. So what does it mean they're sitting with their crowns on their head? The Rambam describes that something very important in the head. And there's something very important. How do we reach this spiritual pleasure that we've been referring to? And the Rambam, based on the rationalist philosophy from which is the world from which he comes, he says, during this life, you work upon yourself. You grow. You gain knowledge. You gain understanding, not only of things of this world, but you gain understanding of God. You gain understanding in such a way that you become so close to the thing that you understand. If I try to understand what this cup of water is in front of me, and I realize that it's a cup of water, and it includes water that I drink, it gives me nourishment and sustenance, and it quenches my thirst. So the more I understand what this glass of water is for, essentially this picture, this idea of what a glass of water is and what water is, enters my head, enters my consciousness, and it becomes part of who I am. So too with anything that we understand more and more. I started with an easy object, an inanimate object. But take a friend, your wife, your husband. The more you understand them, the more you get to know them, the closer you become. So too it is, the Rambam says, with the ultimate spiritual object, or if we can say object, with God himself. the more during this world that we try to understand God, the more we enrich our relationship with Him, the closer we get to Him. And ultimately, that is the source of spiritual pleasure. That is how we're going to achieve closeness to Him. As throughout our lives, we gain greater and greater closeness to Him, understanding of Him, all the way so that we reach such a state that there is oneness, unity between the knower and the object being known. Maimonides says that the soul lives on, and the soul that becomes closer to God essentially is one with God. Close to what the mystics talked about, unio mystica, how there is oneness or unity between the knower and the object being known. This is the idea of atrotehem beroshehem. The crowns are on their heads, or essentially in their heads. The soul lives on with all of its wonderful knowledge that it's gained throughout its life. And it continues to live on from the place where it left off. So essentially, Olam Haba is not to be translated as the world to come. It happens sometime in the future, you'll get some reward for what you've done in this world. But it is an extension of this life, if you will, after the afterlife is a better translation than the world to come. Because the soul, the body, has 120 years, and like the way of all physical things, it goes to the grave. What lives on is the spiritual part of man. The Rambam stresses the knowledge which we gain during the world, especially the knowledge which we gain of spiritual matters, the knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and ultimately, Neheni Meziv HaShechina. That soul will continue to enjoy the closeness which it has achieved throughout its lifetime of being close to God with a spiritual pleasure which will have no end. So basically, two emphases the Rambam wants to say about Olam Haba. The first one is, it doesn't happen later. It's not at the end of days. It really has nothing to do with Mashiach coming, the Messiah coming, or even it doesn't have much to do with the resurrection of the dead. Perhaps we'll talk about that another time. The afterlife, Olam Haba, the ultimate reward which we get for doing the mitzvot, is the relationship which we've created. You create your own Olam Haba. It doesn't happen sometime in the future, but it happens even right now, while we're in this world a little bit. We build this relationship, and ultimately, when we pass out from this world, that relationship will stay. We will remain connected to the spiritual pleasure. We'll remain connected to God forever and ever. And this is the world to come, which we are published. The opposite, of course, if you don't succeed in developing that relationship, you won't be so close to God. Ultimately, your level of spiritual pleasure will be much lower. I just want to add that Maimonides stresses the ratio, the rationale, the mind, and how we've reached a knowledge or understanding of God, and that is what's going to live on with us. Other scholars, other streams perhaps of Jewish thought stress more. Rabbeinu Kreskas in Or Hashem and the Ramchal stress that it's not just about what you think and where your mind is, but also where your heart is and how you feel and how you've developed the other capacities of your personality as well. One more item that I'd like to discuss, and the Rambam raises, is that's all fine and nice. Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek l'olam haba. Everybody has a portion to the world in the world to come or in the afterlife. Some will be greater, some will be lesser. What about what it says in the Torah? The Bible is filled with reward and punishment. Many of us recite the Shema every morning and every evening, where it says that if you do the mitzvot, fulfill the commandments, you'll get reward of the rains coming down, of having bounty, plentiful harvest, and of course the punishment being to be thrown out of your land, to be poor and to suffer poverty and worse. How does that fit in with what we've just learned, that really the ultimate reward is the spiritual pleasure? So Maimonides makes it very clear, and he says, you have to understand, the reason why the Torah is promising us these physical successes is to enable us to further our service of God. The ultimate end is not that we should be able to eat and drink and have peace just so that we should be able to sit back in our easy chairs. Our life is a spiritual pursuit of the truth, of getting closer to God, of understanding God, of understanding the world better and better. It's much harder to do that if we have wars. It's much harder to do that if we're busy our whole lives trying to put the bread on the table. And so the reward and punishment promised in the Torah is not the ultimate end, but they are a means to the end. And though, of course, we all wish upon ourselves that we should have better means, we should have an easier time, so that we're able to progress in our spiritual work, in our avodat Hashem, in our service of God, in our coming closer to building that life which we will have forever after. It'll be much easier to build it if we receive the reward and not the punishment which are mentioned in the Torah. The last thing, which I think is important to understand before we conclude, is the Messiah. Many people talk about the world to come, and right away they're jumping into the Messiah is going to come and make peace on the world, and that's all well and true. The Rambam is very clear and says that there's, based on Shmuel and the Gemara, there's no difference between this world and the world of the Messiah, except that we will have political freedom, we'll be free to serve God, to work on a relationship with God, and have no fetters that we have many times being subjugated in the diaspora. For now, we'll conclude our discussion of the afterlife and the world to come. And Bezrat Hashem, one day we'll talk about the days of the Messiah in another talk. Shalom, shalom.